everyone. So if you can't tell already, I am recording this on Zoom so that I can summarize some of your points and my comments on your points via PowerPoint. I got a little bit of midterm feedback that you like me not being a talking head only, and that theoretical recap is useful. So I hope this is helpful in terms of just summarizing y'all's answers on the discussion questions. Before we get into it, I wanted to address a couple things. One, midterm stuff. Two, discussion group logistics, if there's any more confusion with that. So on the midterm, if you have any questions about grading, how we graded things, why you got the grade that you did, or confusion questions about how to improve stuff, shoot me an email. I love verbal feedback, love giving verbal feedback. I find that it is helpful when you have questions that you can ask me rather than me just telling you what you could explain better. So shoot me an email. Happy to talk about pathways forward for the final. Generally speaking, some of the stuff that I took off points for involved like not writing things in a 5-paragraph essay format and just like bullet points or like a paragraph. I personally find 5-paragraph format super useful in terms of helping the reader understand what points you're trying to make, and just like laying everything out a bit more clearly. Other points, smaller points of improvement, generally speaking, you all, and I say that meaning the whole class, not just my sections, did a good job in terms of theoretical recap. So like, what is neo-mercantilism? What was the example in that Krasner article, right? I think like a little bit more room for improvement, as always, on picking apart sort of the important dimensions of the theories and connecting them with the prompt. This sounds kind of silly, but I like to think of the theories as like different voices, different perspectives, right? So like, what would the neo-mercantilists say? What would the constructivists say? And when I'm thinking through that, it's helpful to note that the theories often place importance on different actors, right? So the neo-mercantilist perspective would highlight the role of the state, constructivists, the role of individuals, and non-state organizations, and obviously IO model on international organizations and what they do. So that said, when you're thinking through like which theories might best fit the situation, maybe think about the actors that are important in the situation that you're trying to analyze, right? So, and I think this will become clear like as we even go through these slides. Like for the loan trade article, it was very clear that like the international banking community running around to different countries was like pretty important in terms of the moral hazard that resulted in later crises, right? And so like constructivism would be a really useful perspective to think about international banking from, because there is such a highly influential role of these international bankers, right? Or for example, there might be a case of issue linkage where like where a state like might be able to get a loan, but has to give up concessions in terms of domestic fiscal policy, right? And maybe they're making that deal with an international organization who also has incentives potentially dictated by the member states. So that's all to say that these theories often overlap, but they tend to sort of place emphasis on different actors, and I find that to be a useful way of thinking through stuff. So yeah, as I said, if you've got any questions on the midterm, let me know. I think, yeah, you guys are all mostly seeming to like get the material, and most of you are rigorously sort of thinking through how to flexibly apply these theories to different concepts. So yeah, good job. Let me know if y'all have any more questions. On the group responses, I would just like to say that I was extremely impressed after a bit of confusion in terms of assignments, that kind of thing to begin with all of your replies. Some of you wrote pages, really good pages. So like, I'm impressed. That was awesome. If you happened to write a few pages for this and that was like, whoa, way too much work, you don't need to write pages. Thoughtful bullet points are fine. But if you have the time and you feel so moved, I enjoy reading interesting answers. So yeah, it was actually quite fun to go through your replies. And if you're having problems getting in touch with your group members, let me know and I can try sending out individual emails. In a class that I'm taking, B Courses has not been delivering emails sent from the website to everyone in the class, and it seems that people are missing emails at random. I think that might be the case here too, and we don't know how to fix it. So if you don't seem to be getting notifications, or your group members don't seem to be getting notifications or getting in touch with you, let me know and I will reach out to them directly, like just normal email, so that B Courses does not mess it up. Online communication is hard, and I understand that there might be delays, miscommunication, you don't turn the thing in on time. For these section assignments, like, that's not the end of the world. I'm happy to be flexible. So yeah, just let me know if there seems to be coordination problems and I will try to fix it. Cool. So let's dive right in. I mostly just went through your responses and obviously pulled out some of the interesting bits, interesting examples that you all provided. And I think the most useful thing to do would be to sort of think through the way that the different crises kind of line up with the theories in terms of the relevant actors and the way that we can understand this stuff. So the most sort of the easiest one, of course, was the loan trade article. Super fun. We read this in the grad version of the class, and yeah, I love it. It's great. It really gets you into the middle of the story in an entertaining way. So a lot of you guys, like, obviously pointed out constructivism in terms of the role of the banking elite. Great job. And sort of the shared norms that this group of community kind of perpetuates. And here is, I think, a nice place to bring up the moral hazard part of the problem in terms of banking, right? So these banks and their envoys don't necessarily have an incentive to self-regulate if they know that, well, if they think that on one hand, the states won't default, right? So these banks are lending money to the Philippines and the Filipino state won't default on the loan, right? Like, okay, so these banks think they're gonna get paid back, and if everything goes to heck in the developing countries, they're too big to fail in the US and they'll get bailed out too, right? So this unregulated moral hazard that hadn't yet resulted in a crisis sort of began in the loan trade and kind of culminates in the 1980s debt crisis. So good on the constructivism. In terms of overall structure model, yeah, it seems pretty self-evident that, like, these banks in rich countries, like, were profiting off of nefarious banking practices in the developing world. And because they are banks from wealthy, well-off countries, they're sort of able to do so without incurring too much personal loss. And they might have been aware that they weren't making great loans at the top level. A lot of you mentioned that, like, yeah, these bankers didn't have any incentive to do anything good with these, to do anything like particularly morally astute. They were just trying to, like, get their pay increase. But I also think that from the top, right, from the top of the banking community, there's a little bit of willful ignorance happening in terms of an incentive to not pay attention to what the problems might be, as long as things are generally going up in terms of profits. More interestingly, some of y'all mentioned dependency, and I thought that was really cool. In terms of the connection between the core of the banking community in the United States coordinating with the core of the periphery in the Philippines. And the real question is here, who loses, right? And the financial elite in both places will probably be fine. It's the everyday people in the Philippines that are facing the recession, that would face the recession on an everyday level, that really get exploited. So even though one might think that getting funding from international banks might help a developing country grow its economy and increase the standard of living for people, if the relationship is really one of extraction, where the elites are colluding and this money isn't invested in anything that's actually going to help anyone, that kind of feels like a dependency type of relationship. And I think it's nice to bring it up here because dependency often gets shoehorned into the Latin American context. That's where it came from. But that kind of relationship really characterizes, like, a lot of interactions in the international system. Yeah, so I think good connection there. That's about it for the loan trade. So moving forward, 1980s in Latin America. A couple of the theories that you guys mentioned. First, in terms of overall structure, the North American banks that were large kind of led the way in terms of getting the banking cartel together. potentially because they were heavily invested and really didn't want to lose all of their money. But needless to say, like, these large banks did indeed help spearhead the banking collective action problem. If you remember from the article, the collective action problem is that if a few banks decide that they'll roll over, if most banks decide that they'll roll over loans, then a few banks can kind of collect the loans today. And that begs the question of, like, who gets to collect the loans today and who's going to roll over the loans tomorrow. The sort of problem being that everyone's going to want the money now. And no one's going to want to be that bank who waits and sort of lets everyone else get their money first. So banks with more incentive to prevent crisis also happens to be large banks in control of information. And given that power dynamic, they were able to get all of the banks together in terms of crisis management. Cool. So in terms of dependency, actually, we're going to talk about IO model first. I think that better transition. So in terms of the IO model, everyone, of course, was like, the IMF, cooperation, it sort of institutionalized crisis management. And, like, yes, that's right. It did the things that IOs do in terms of providing a forum for negotiation, reducing transaction costs, free flows of information, coordinating actors, blah, blah, blah. However, like, it's important to remember, and this is where the dependency angle comes in, that the IMF is bound by its largest contributors, right? So it is accountable to the member states that are putting down the most money, the United States, right? So to some degree, the IMF is thinking about crisis management with the interests of powerful countries in mind. And this is somewhat evident in terms of the way that they managed the crisis, right? So I think a lot of you said that, like, yes, they did a good job, like, this totally fixed things. And I would say, like, it contained the crisis, to borrow one of someone's discussion response language, contained the crisis, but it allowed for the continuation of moral hazard in terms of banking practices. So even though the IMF was able to sort of put together this plan for debt rescheduling, collecting money from commercial banks to continue allowing for the rolling over of the debt, it also didn't restrain the banks that kind of allowed this to happen in the first place, potentially because they were banks that came from one of the IMF's largest contributing members. So that's cool. As a dependency sort of angle on this, one might think that as these developing countries get loans from the IMF and then have to borrow money from other countries to pay interest on the loans, and the debt keeps getting pushed further and further down the line, like, maybe they're continually becoming dependent on Western capital, and continually tied to these powerful countries in a way that might not be beneficial for their economic growth. Oftentimes when we think about the IMF, we think about stringent domestic structural reforms that take away policy tools from emerging markets, and can potentially lead to, like, underdevelopment in certain places. So the periphery gets a little bit, but it doesn't ever get to the level of developing countries. That's not to say that if the IMF hadn't imposed conditionality on loans, that these developing countries, Latin American countries, would have taken the loan money and done great things with it in terms of growing their domestic economy. But the fact of the matter is that IMF conditionality it limits what emerging economies can do, and that often leads to political tension, turmoil, not good stuff. So I would say that, yeah, the IMF helped, but they also have vested interests in this, and they're not necessarily looking out for the developing countries as much as you might like them to. Cool. Onwards and upwards to the 2008 recession. So, as many of you guys noted, once again, the professionals handled it, especially the role of the Fed, and that kind of ties into the overall structure model, at least like one cool example of it. In terms of crisis resolution, quantitative easing was like this crazy novel thing that no one had done before. Oh my God, is it going to get us out of this crisis? And the Fed led on that in terms of dropping interest rates. If you need a refresher on how this works, when the Fed lowers the interest rate, they're lowering the interest rate on the money that banks can borrow to lend to people. So kind of a two-step process here. So when the Fed lowers the interest rate, the money supply increases because banks are borrowing more money to go lend out to people like you and me. When the money supply increases and normal consumers can borrow money for lower interest rates, that means that we buy more things. So when there's a recession, a useful way to get out of it is to incentivize an increase in consumption, because a recession is just a decrease in aggregate demand. So when the Fed lowers interest rates, it becomes cheaper for us to buy stuff. Recession might be mitigated. This also could lead to inflation, right? Increasing the money supply can get you into a space of inflation. That's not been a problem for a really long time. So yeah, quantitative easing works pretty well. And because the US did it first, a lot of other countries sort of jumped on afterwards. And so US leadership in terms of global fiscal policy global monetary policy coordination was pretty critical here, because countries around the world sort of adopted an expansionary policy rather than a contractionary policy, right? Expansionary, increasing the money supply; contractionary, shrinking it. Contractionary, synonymous with austerity, which is what the IMF likes to do. They love austerity. So anti-IMF response, just kidding. But anyway, expansionary monetary policy kind of got us out of that. That being said, because interest rates are already so low, we can't really do it again in terms of getting out of this, this being COVID. Unfortunately, with COVID, there's also the unfortunate fact that many businesses simply can't open. So even if we had more money to spend on things, wouldn't necessarily be going back into the small local businesses that we all know and love. It probably will go to Amazon as they're price gouging you for toilet paper. So we can't really use expansionary monetary policy here, and I feel like the conditions might be such that it wouldn't work as well anyway. That's not optimistic, but apologies. Cool. And then finally, in terms of thinking about this from an economic process perspective, it sort of begs the question of are these boom and bust cycles normal? And is this just kind of what happens when the market overheats and speculation drives up the price of things? Is this just kind of normal fluctuations? Sometimes there's a crash. And I think a couple of y'all answered the question, this part of the bonus question, and I really liked the answer that was yeah, it's normal if it's capitalism. It's yes, that's an interesting take. Just because that's sort of what neoliberal economists would say. Maybe they don't predict the 2008 recession, but at the same time, fluctuations in the market are kind of, from a neoliberal perspective, normal. That being said, if you're thinking about this from a different state's perspective, perhaps an emerging market, it might not be an ideal state of normal, right? Given that, the 2008 recession led to an inflow of capital in emerging economies. That being said, I think that the cycles of boom and bust that a capitalist market contributes to do not necessarily support the growth and stability of emerging markets seeking to acquire higher technology, more human capital, and that kind of thing. So I think the economic processes model is kind of shorthand for neoliberal economics, and that comes loaded with a lot of assumptions that were often theoretically developed in the context of developed countries looking at the market and coming up with rules for how it works. So yeah, economic processes model. It's biased, even if it seems like it's just econ. Yes. So that's about all I've got for you on the 2008 recession. I didn't focus so much on the IO stuff here, just Basel reforms, etc. There's a timeline on that in the reading, and I'm not going to make you listen to me talk about it right now. But if you have any other questions on this stuff, let me know. Next week is transnational corporations. The discussion questions for that, and I've posted this in multiple places, are not due next week because there are a couple more lectures one more lecture after next Tuesday on TNCs. So they're going to be due not this coming Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that. And I believe that's April 21st. So you have a little bit more time for that. If you have any questions on this material for debt, let me know. If you've got questions on transnational corporation stuff, let me know. I love the transnational corporation stuff. It's really my wheelhouse. I'm very excited about it. So yeah, great place to ask more questions. All right, y'all. I will see you in class on Tuesday. And as always, check in with me if anything's going on. All right, bye.